Welcome everyone to another CPSS Prep webinar where we explore how sports science is applied in real-world performance settings by leading practitioners. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Daniel Yu, and I'm the sports scientist and strength and conditioning coach for the Orlando Magic, and I'm joined by my co-host, Nick.
How's it going, everyone? My name is Nick. I'm a physical therapist and athletic trainer in the NBA, and excited to join in tonight and have you guys all on this talk.
Awesome. And today's guest is Dr. Gregory Haff. You guys probably all already know him. Dr. Haff is a professor of strength and conditioning at Edith Cowan University and the director of the Strength and Power Research Group. He also served as the president of the NSCA from 2015 to 2018. He has authored more than 270 scientific publications and 9 books. Nick and I are especially excited to have Dr. Haff today to discuss his chapter from the NSCA Essentials of Sports Science textbook, which is Periodization and Programming for Individual Sports, and how he applies those concepts in practice. And just as we said earlier, if you have any questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat, and Nick and I will be monitoring the discussion, and we'll save time for Q&A at the end. And with that, Dr. Haff, we'll just kick it off. So Nick and I, we have a group that we work together with to help prepare people to pass the CPSS exam. And one of the most
Mhm.
common questions we get is like, what's the difference between programming and periodization? Would you be able to touch on that?
Oh, yeah, I actually think that's probably the greatest space of confusion for people right now. Um, so the way I look at it, and my thoughts on periodization have evolved over the last 20 to 30 years now. I think a lot of the research that's out there is programming and not really on periodization, especially the modern research. And so people are looking at different programming tactics and how the body responds in these very short time windows. 12 weeks is a pretty short time window. So when we start to look at the actual scientific world, I think they're often making very large conclusions about periodization based on programming tactics. So what are programming tactics? That's your modes and methods and methodologies of trying to create some sort of adaptation in the human physiology or change performance. And the best way you can think of it is it's a micromanagement strategy, and it's infinitely flexible. So, working in basketball, which you both do, tight training schedules, the individual athlete is responding or recovering in different ways. So you can actually change your programming tactics based on your monitoring plan. However, when we start to think about the whole construct of periodization, people are like, periodization is useless. We don't need it anymore. Just program. And that is a really flawed logic in my mind because you can't just infinitely just rotate programming strategies and just hope to get somewhere. The synonym that I use with my students is like getting in your car and just kind of randomly trying to get somewhere. Um, if you have a plan of a direction that you're trying to go, where are you trying to go? If I'm in professional basketball, I have a schedule. I have that set by the league. I know where my competitions are around the country, and that dictates some of my planning. So for me, periodization is a macro management strategy where I'm going to outline specific factors. When I work in the military space, I often refer to it as an operational plan. It's what we're trying to look at from a higher order construct of where we're trying to go. So this sets frameworks. Like, for example, I know that in season I need to be in different physiological places than I do in an off season. And some sports are really good for this. American football, simple. Why? Because the season is when the season is. There is no games in the off season. Premier League soccer, completely different construct because they have a lot less off season time. So we have to think about the macro management. So what goes into the macro management? I think we as strength and conditioning professionals get stuck on resistance training. Periodization was not invented for resistance training. I really get frustrated when I see modern sports scientists write articles and say periodization was invented for resistance training, and that is a bunch of bunk. In fact, the original notations of periodization are back in ancient Rome in the tetrad for military preparation. It was actually for military constructs. And so when we start to look at the macro management, it is more than just the sets, the reps, and getting in the gym. It is balancing training factors. What are the training factors that this sport or individual needs? Integration of nutrition. Periodization of nutrition is probably one of the most important factors in modern sport. And there's some wonderful work coming out of Great Britain in this space, which I think is really informative about how we can manage body weight, body composition, recovery with sound strategic nutrition strategies that align with our actual programming constructs. Um, that's one thing. The other thing that we can think about in the macro management is where we're going to do our psychological training. The psychological team building things that occur in season are very different than off season. And then also you have to think about how all this integrates with tactical and technical training. And I know a lot of I really get frustrated a lot of times. Modern periodization theories are like, well, we're considering tactical and technical. Well, I hate to be a bearer of bad news, but the original periodization theories were all about integrating everything. And I think you have to kind of think about that. So, to kind of sum that up, periodization is an integrative approach to managing training. It's to help athletes go in a direction. And what we do under that are programming tactics. And those tactics are helping us guide the athlete towards where they need to be successful. And I think that's the important thing. It makes no sense for me to prepare an athlete to be infinitely successful in training and fail in competition. I coach weightlifters and I'm like, I don't care how strong you are in training. I need you to be the best you can be in competition. If you're not the best you can be there, then we've done something wrong. And I think that's where the dynamics gets a little bit confused in the literature. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to everyone.
No, that's awesome. And Daniel and I talk about it too, especially with how often we play in basketball, which is a little bit unique to the sport, but like keeping the main thing, which
Yep.
is the sport.
Yeah.
And this is something that Daniel and I have also touched on and talked about too, is like with periodization, like how would you define success in a like with a professional team? And that can be like something more Olympic driven versus more team sport. Yeah, what does success look like in creating that periodization plan?
So success is an interesting construct, and really success can be measured in many ways. If I'm building a youth athlete who's in the beginning of their long-term athlete development plan, which really is multiple multi-year periodized plans, success is building the foundation of robust physical capacities that underpin future performance. If I'm working with, an Olympian who is going to their second Olympics, obviously success is, are we on the podium or not? And I think you have to kind of think of it that way. Team sports are where it gets a little bit murky because you really can't be to a pinnacle. Like, Olympics, we know when the Olympics are, we know when the finals are, we know where all the lead ups are. And innately, this is where critics of periodization go, but it's easy in those sports. Yeah, it is easier. It's not easy because the human being has a great capacity to screw up the best training plans by making bad life decisions and having psychological kind of hurdles that handicap their development. In team sports, it's a little bit more difficult because you have team dynamics. You can have, someone doesn't always have to be at optimal performance if the team as a whole is at optimal performance. And so for success in a team sport is consistency. Can we play at a high level consistently over time? And really, if you look at teams that make it deep into playoffs and things like that, those are the teams that have consistent performance and lower injury rates. If you have high injury rates, inconsistent performance, you generally don't do very well. And I think that's the really big factor. And I think in season where we have definitive markers of success are where are we winning when we should? And do we get some of the ones that we weren't so sure that we were going to win? Do we actually accomplish success there? Because, like it or not, momentum in team sports is a big thing. If you start to lose momentum, the gremlins come and you start to think about, from a psychological perspective, you start to question everything, and that becomes problematic. So for me, success is, it could be a multitude of things. Obviously, let's be honest, in sport, winning is the main barometer of a successful program. Lower injury risks or player wellness is important. But I do know that many professional teams winning becomes the main factor with moderation of injury risk.
And then and kind of tying in with that as well, like um, with modern periodization, I'll start using that. It's holistic and you have all these different factors. You mentioned nutrition,
Yeah.
psychological readiness, mental performance, and then you have your traditional thoughts, right? Of like strength, speed, conditioning, skill
Yeah.
development. How do you go about prioritizing? So, you know, you have this team-based goal, you have this annual plan, and then how do you go into the next level of making it individualized? Just
I think
curious your thoughts on that.
the first thing I'll do is I'll correct you a little bit.
Yeah,
Actually, Matt Viev actually talked about holistic training in his original Russian book, if you get the translation.
yeah,
Not a new concept. The Russians were phenomenally detailed in their understanding of holistic athlete training. Now, there was
perfect.
a huge communist slant to it, and it was a little bit different. Um, and the things they did were a little bit challenging. And the Chinese have a massively holistic program that's built within their culture. So
That's right.
when we start to look at periodization in the modern era, I think, and this is my own opinion, we've pivoted away too much from training. We're so worried about preventing injury that we're not getting enough training stimulus. And sometimes our monitoring strategies are preventing us from building the physical robustness that we kind of need. And I think it's a balancing act of pushing when we have to, pulling back when we can. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge. And I would also argue just because we can measure it doesn't mean we should. I think we're swamped with measuring and monitoring metrics that no human can actually interpret. I know my really good friend Joe Clubb, who I really respect immensely, she does some wonderful online and consulting and educational materials on monitoring and that nexus between performance, injury management, and making sure the athlete moves forward. And I think her approach probably is in alignment with what I kind of think as well. Um, so I think the reality is that I think we're undertraining a lot of athletes right now. And that's my own opinion. And I think we've lost sight of the fact that the human can actually push themselves quite hard. I've worked in the defense space, I've worked in special operations, and I can tell you that, I mean, I've worked with, not, I have not been in, I don't want to, have stolen valor or anything. Um, what we see in that population is how far they physically can push themselves into the red. And that is a characteristic of elite athletes as well. And so we have to kind of manage them, but I just lately I've gotten concerned seeing how much monitoring is defaulting to rest in the idea of mental health and wellness. And I would always argue, well, if I get out of shape, my mental health and wellness is going to get a lot worse when I come back on to play if I haven't managed the training correctly. So, I mean, that's kind of my take on it. And it's a difficult one because we have to be holistic, but we have to push when we need to push.
That's excellent. Yeah, and it's a conversation that we've had as a staff too with our preseason camp is 4 days. And so a lot of our, off-season work is building that what we call is like a core callus to the demands of the
Mhm.
sport. And we can't do that in a, 2-week ramp or 3-week ramp. And in order for us to taper at the end of the season for postseason, if we don't have a base going into the season, how do we taper and draw back when we haven't exposed them enough? We're going 82 plus games. So no, I appreciate that sentiment, and I think it's a great one.
Well, I think you really highlight a big point. A lot of people falsely think they need to taper into the season, and that can be problematic if you haven't built a big enough foundation. So we all can find teams in various professional sports that come out the gate and they look like they're going to be the greatest team in the league, and then towards the middle they just start cratering. From a periodization perspective, it would be possible that a couple things are going on. One, they've tapered into the season, and thus, when you taper, you actually lose fitness. Let's be honest. You're revealing fatigue and losing some fitness. And you won't see the negative effects until about 3 to 4, maybe 5 weeks after the initiation of the season. And then you'll start to see a decline. What I always tell teams I work with, it's kind of like a slow burn. The beginning of the season, you should be kind of squeaking by because you still have some residual fatigue. You win in the games you have to win and the ones, and then you start to find your stride towards the back end. And I think that's where it gets a little bit challenging because when you have a team of diverse aged people with diverse training backgrounds, the training stimulus that, for example, a 15-year veteran needs is very different than a 2-year. veteran, and you have to manage things in a little bit different way. And that's where the programming tactics are where the difference is. It's not the periodization that's different. It's the tactics that we use to get them the physiological adaptations. You know, the analogy I always use is with the squat. I am a big fan of the squat. I think it's a key exercise for developing lower body robustness. A lot of people would argue against that, but it is a belief system that is based on science and experience. But that doesn't mean if my athlete has a back injury, I'm going to make them squat. I'm going to do something else to build leg strength and still accomplish the goal. I've changed the tactic. Have I moved to a tactic that I think is suboptimal? Potentially, but it's optimal for the athlete in the place they are. And I think that's what a lot of us get stuck in systems, and we have to be able to move as the athlete's physiology is changing or injury status is changing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I think that makes so much sense of like the your 15-year veteran, the training stimulus is different from a 2-year veteran, and even like the draft has passed for Nick and I. Like so today or tomorrow we're getting our draft guys who might be one and done in college or they've
Yeah.
played there for 4 years, and those guys all have different types of training stimulus. Bringing us back a little bit, you mentioned not everything that we can measure, we should measure. I
Yeah.
feel like I've been hearing that a lot more common, especially like the last few years as technology has become so readily available, as well as this data collection in general. Are there certain metrics or like categories of metrics that you think we shouldn't be measuring, and maybe some that you think that we should be measuring but aren't?
This is the great depends question. It depends. It's not cut and dry because it's very sport specific. For me, I think I'll approach it from a different perspective. What do I think we should be measuring? I definitely think a vertical jump is a very powerful monitoring tool, especially if you use advanced analytical procedures. Like we do what's called statistical parametric mapping, and we track the changes in the waveform. We don't actually use discrete stuff. We actually look at the waveform because even in overtraining, a lot of really high caliber athletes can still achieve the same displacement. But how they get there, the actual movement pattern is shifting. They're auto-regulating it to still accomplish the task. So I think vertical jump testing is a plus. I do think strength testing is necessary. I'm a big fan of the isometric mid-thigh pull. Obviously, I wrote the first paper on that with Professor Stone in 1997. I think it's a safe test when done correctly. I find a lot of people do it incorrectly. We've done millions of tests on people and not had, injuries at all. Um, Knock on wood. And that I think gives us a good diagnostic of raw lower body strength. That's just a simple isometric test, gives us force plate testing. If we have dual force plates, we can also get asymmetries from the vertical jump and the isometric. And we know that as we can use asymmetry creep. What I mean by that is if we start to see an athlete develop asymmetries, we actually can then start to put some corrective strategies in within reason. We don't have to make it perfect because we don't want to try to change the athlete's natural state. If that's their natural state, slightly asymmetrical, we don't want to have to, just because it's asymmetrical a little bit doesn't mean it has to be perfect. I think we get a little fixated on these things. I think those two things are critical. I actually think body composition is important. I know that's a touchy one for people. I know a lot of sporting programs around the world are no longer looking at body composition because of psychological body dysmorphic kind of responses. But losing lean mass can be problematic, and losing lean mass can be a difficult thing. So I like DEXA scans for a multitude of reasons. One, because we can look at the body as a whole for health and wellness from a bone perspective, but also from a body fat perspective. So I can look at lean tissue and fat mass and things like that. I think for me, that's my basic core, but I also have to think about a construct of what is monitoring and what is benchmarking. Those are two different things for me. So benchmarking is going to be planned in my periodized overall structure. Specific time points throughout the year, I'm going to do benchmark testing. And this is to see where the athlete is in relationship to a model that I have established for the sport I'm in. For example, In the military space, special forces operators, and this is going to probably shock a lot of people, they will generally need to be able to isometric mid-thigh pull somewhere between 35 and 40 newtons per kilogram to make it through selection. And that's quite high. And in fact, that's really high. Now we do have NFL players and that are above that. But if you think about a military person, 35 to 40 newtons per kilogram, and Paul Comfort and I have been working a lot to try to create, databases and things of that nature related to that benchmark. So we can use that as a tracking tool to see if our program is actually making changes. I also think that, um, for example, body composition is a good one. You're not going to run a DEXA every week to monitor. You're going to do it at certain benchmarking time points. Obviously, if they go away for the off season, you don't want them coming back fatter or more non-functional mass for the season, things like that. And also, we want to look at the bone mineral density at different times because when we're under high stress and high loading for a long period of time, stress fractures and things can start to degrade the consistency of the bone. Monitoring, on the other hand, is about judging the athlete's, I hate the term state of readiness because I don't know what that means. I want to look at their daily, state, basically. How are they responding to training? It's not readiness to train, because that would infer that if you're not ready to train, you shouldn't train. And I would argue that in season, you only don't train when you really have problems. You have to reduce training and still train. And so I think from that perspective, certain tests, for example, the vertical jump is an easy one because you can do it very quickly. I think, there are other ones. For example, British track cycling used to use a loaded vertical jump and look at impulse, and they would measure impulse before every training session. And they could track the athletes' progress throughout their preparation for the Olympic Games, and that was pre 2012, pre 2016 when they were the gold medal factory in track cycling. So I think you have to develop models of testing that align with your sport. The tests that I'll use with an NFL player are probably very different than what I will use with a professional basketball player in the NBA. I think that's really important. And the thing is, if we can collect enough data, we can actually personalize training. And this is where our research team is trying to get. We're trying to get to what we call precision strength and conditioning, where we actually use machine learning and data modeling to kind of predict loading structures based on the state of the monitoring tools we're using and the benchmarking tools we're using. The interesting thing with that is we've also got to do psychological measures. For example, wellness questionnaires are great, but the problem with wellness questionnaires is often athletes lie. Let's be honest. And as they get fatigued with monitoring, everything deviates to the mean. They just go down the middle. I've worked with some NFL teams that have told me that they can't trust any kind of RPE or testing data, especially in a contract year. They just, everything's fine. So I think that can be problematic. And how do you get around that? I don't know. Some unions don't even let people do those type of monitoring questions. Externally, like in Australia, it's very common nature. They've been doing it all the time, but I almost would argue they're overreactive to those monitoring things. To use a story about monitoring, um, Australia Institute of Sport had the Gymnastics Australia had to do monitoring. They were doing these readiness to train questionnaires, and one of my athletes, who's a coach, was skeptical, and he relayed to me that within a week, the athletes figured out how to manipulate the monitoring in order to get out of training. Because gymnastics is a very high training sport. It's repetitive, 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 repetitive. And it kind of cemented to me that we've got to take some of this monitoring with a grain of salt. We have to know the personality traits of our athletes because you're going to have a basket that are, going to overwork themselves. That's just who they are. They're always going to push to the red line and you got to pull back on them. And then you got another basket that is going to be like, yeah, I'm going to do everything in my power to get out of training and all I want to do is compete. And then you've got a group in the middle. And so we've got to kind of develop the normative data for the athletes we're working on. And so if you've got an athlete who grinds themselves all the time, small changes in wellness markers could be really big. If you have someone who's always soft and doesn't want to train, large changes may mean nothing. And so this is where that I believe we've got to get back to personal connections with athletes. where we know our people, we communicate with our people, and we create that environment of trust. Because I actually think that can be much more powerful monitoring than a lot of the tools that we have today. Because honesty is not always a good something that people are at the current juncture in time.
For sure, yeah. Um, I feel like with so many of our athletes too, we don't do the questionnaires with them, but like we know their personality just from engaging with them, seeing them every day for pretty much
Mhm.
9 months out of the year, right? Like just from the way they walk in and like how short their responses are to me, I feel like I could get a gauge of like, oh, either something happened at home, they're super tired, or like they had a bad game the day before, and maybe because of that bad game, they're just like presenting as like tired and lethargic. But there's so many pieces that go into it. And I think that's so interesting about the what do you call it? Precision weight training that you guys are developing with the machine learning.
In strength and conditioning is where we're trying to get to.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. And it's based on the idea of precision medicine. So there's some initiatives in Australia at the moment called digital twin modeling, where they're trying to create digital twins of their Olympic athletes. It's moving quite slow, but I do think it has promise in the future. I would actually highlight something you said about, knowing the athletes, watching them, seeing them. My wife is an elite coach, and she's one of the best I've ever worked with. And I don't say that just because she's my wife. But I watched her working in professional sports in Australia, and she would watch the athletes during the warm-ups and looking at how they engage in their movement patterns. And she had a model for each athlete in her mind about what their normal look is. And she would actually be able to pick, the athletes that were, struggling or trying to hide something from the staff just by watching how they engage in their warm-up, either for the court, it was professional netball, or in the weight room and how they actually moved. So having a model in your mind of what your athletes move, typical movement strategies are, can really be a way to see when something's happening before it actually happens. And again, the big problem with monitoring internal load is it's dependent on honesty from the individual. And that is, I question that people are honest because again, working in certain environments, they're never going to tell you that something is wrong or they're weak. And in other environments, it could be everything is just, horrible stress, and you just can't find that middle.
Yeah, there's that fine line between having the athlete feel the impact that goes back and influences their performance rather than, like you said, something that just takes away their training or something that they can manipulate, but also is not like we take the information and we do nothing with it, even though sometimes that's the case. And yeah, then they're second guessing, like, hey, why am I doing this if nothing's going to change? And you have almost that desensitization to the monitoring that you're doing. And then kind of like a follow-up question to that is uh like typical, like Daniel and I've kind of asked each other this, we have asked other people in the field, like the it might be test specific, but that like model that you're talking about of finding typical, how many tests or times is that before you start to understand like you have enough counter movement jumps to start to understand an average or like a typical for that person, just for an example.
So I think, this is where teams that have players that are with them for a while can really do retrospective modeling, where they can look back at, their data bank and say, okay, what do we have? And then you can kind of data mine it. And large language models may be really useful for this kind of thing if they are not connected to the net, so to speak, residential large language models. We know that, for example, in a vertical jump, if they're a jumping athlete, they should have that pretty much well established. It's just making sure the baseline testing is done when they're in a fatigue-free state and fatigue isn't, where it's kind of a weird one, where fatigue isn't impacting it or detraining isn't impacting it. Because, if you're completely fatigue-free, you could be detrained. And so you've kind of got to figure out that sweet spot. I don't have a good answer for that because I don't know anybody that's actually looked at that. I know that, for example, Stu Cormack, who is a professor down at Australian Catholic University, worked in the Australian Football League, and he used to do 5 vertical jumps for every test, and then use the mean of that because that would give you a more stable baseline. Um, and there's some efficacy to that. I know in the mid thigh pull, we're looking at somewhere between 3 and 5 as well, and then looking at the mean of the curves. One of the things that you have to realize, I think, is that when we're monitoring is we're trying to get mechanical markers of how the physiology is responding. So ultimately, if we don't understand how physiology works, and I'm going to quote Dr. Kramer, he's pretty adamant that if you don't understand physiology, you can't understand training, and Professor Stone would argue the same. And I'm going to echo it because I'm seeing a lot of stuff on training and monitoring that forgets that there are actual time periods where you should be fatigued and your vertical jump should be down. If you are trying to optimize your performance all the time, you will never move forward. And I always look at it this way: 2 steps back, excuse me, 1 step back, 2 steps forward. So when we get fatigued, we see reductions in performance capacity, but we rebound if we've trained appropriately. And that is really the secret sauce behind sequential models of periodization or certain sequential loading tactics over time. And and that's why the annual plan is so important because we've got to know where we need to recover. We could even look at this on a micro scale, like at the microcycle level. If I have a football game on Saturday, well, obviously I'm going to load up during the beginning of the week to get my stimulus to saturate the body to uh, either change with physiology or maintain certain attributes. And I'm going to reduce training load towards the end so that the fatigue dissipates so I can perform well at the back end. And if it's a team that's really good, then I'm going to probably reduce the loading a lot so that I can recover to a higher level. If it's a team that I should always beat and I have never lost to, I can play the chance of not reducing as much. And I think that's really where we start to look at modeling. Sam Robertson and David Joyce did a wonderful paper where they actually did a tactical model to look at the distance traveled with the current state in the rankings in the league where they were ranked last year and tried to predict how much change. It was a very rudimentary model at the time. I think we can do better now if we have the actual data to do it.
That's awesome. Um, I'm just realizing we had a question in the chat. I don't want to push it off. I'm gonna bring it up now. It's from Garrett Evans. He said, "Could you discuss some aspects of changing programming slash monitoring during preseason competitive periods, still giving the stimulus and recovery needed to potentially supercompensate?" Thanks.
It's a really good question. Well, first off, I think the thing that you have to realize is that preseason for me is really synonymous with the pre-competition period, and it's just a transition point where we're moving from our off. And I don't actually like the term off-season, preseason, in season because off-season to me intellectually is off, meaning do nothing. And that is as we talked about previously, is actually the time when we need the most training. And that's where we should be developing our foundation for the year. If the foundation isn't developed, all the tapering in the world is not going to have us win. And so I think that the challenge really from a programming perspective is manipulating training loads, not specifically in the preseason per se, it's the in season. The preseason, in a lot of ways, is in the American model, preseason camps, right? If you think about it, that's an accumulation block because training loads are going up from the technical tactical increase. And so you've got to modulate your other training factors around that because what a coach is doing, they're installing systems, they're working on team dynamics, and you're trying to maintain your strength and conditioning at some level around that. And it gets a little bit tricky. Now, competitive periods, I believe, are dictated by more flexible programming strategies, but understanding where the opportunities are to load the system. And I think you have to kind of look at that. Now, what does monitoring do for me in that time frame? It allows me to understand how much I can load the person. I don't look at it from the lens of how much I can reduce training. I look at it through the lens of how much can I load training. Because without load or without stimulus, I can't maintain adaptation or stimulate adaptation. My really good friend, Dr. Dan Baker, who's quite a famous strength coach in Australia, used to work with the Brisbane Broncos, and he shared data with us that they won their grand final. Typically, they were stronger at the end of the year than they were at the beginning of the year, or pretty darn close to the same, somewhere in that window. So his strategies in season of using monitoring, manipulating training load ensured that they maintained their physical prowess towards the end of the year, and then they would win. When they weren't capable of doing that, they tended to lose. Um, and so I think that's an important construct is you've got to think about your philosophical slant. I know a lot of strength and conditioning coaches, high performance managers that look at it as, oh, we've made a ceiling of training load. We don't need to train anymore. I look at it as a basement. This is the minimum I need. What can I do above that? And where can I plan that within each microcycle around the games? And obviously, for each athlete, that is going to be very different. My 15 to 20-year vet is not going to be able to tolerate as high a training stimulus, but they already have a higher physiological base, hopefully, from the 20 years of training. And they make up for maybe a little bit less physical capacity associated with aging with tactical knowledge and responsiveness. Tom Brady at the end of his career in the NFL, he was just a master of tactics. And so I think you have to kind of look at it from that lens. Super compensation is really just manipulating training stimulus with recovery. So let's say I'll use the Saturday game again. If Saturday is the game, we're going to try to reduce training load towards the end of the week. Why? To reveal what we actually developed or made at the beginning of the week.
Those are all very good points and appreciate the question, Garrett. I think it's something that, like you mentioned, it's hard to navigate in season, but I like the point of how much can that athlete tolerate with their demands rather than thinking about like just the minimum amount.
Yeah.
Because for us, again, like I know we're kind of always tying it back to basketball, but if someone's in the rotation or if they're playing, 35 plus minutes or someone that's not in the rotation and not playing at all, like there's also this element of what we call as like a stay ready group. And that's also the something that we have to periodize and program for is like we get later in the season. I mean, the likelihood of everyone playing 82 games all the time is
Huh.
goal. I don't think it's impossible, but yeah, I think like you have these situations where guys come in and out of the lineup and it gets especially challenging when you're, 4 months, 5 months into the season and players that then get thrusted into 20 plus minutes that haven't done that in the entire year. How are you doing
Mhm.
that on the side by also remaining available to thrust into play? So like the more times that you have those exposures in practice that increase your
Mhm.
likelihood technically of,
Yeah.
injury or high risk events. Um,
Yeah.
we can't coddle them through the season because otherwise you get into action and they won't be able to last because they haven't built that callus. So there's
Yeah.
just some thoughts that I've as you were talking. So I appreciate that.
No worries.
The another question here we have about one more. I want to respect your time and everyone else on the call. The one thing I'm interested in as well is for those that have congested playing schedules,
Mhm.
how do you balance testing in a fatigue state during the season and
Yeah.
understanding that and getting context to that data that you have right in front of you, knowing, at least in basketball, we play 3.5 times a week. So it's hard to
Yep.
say like, hey, like, it's not necessarily a non-fatigued. What are, some thoughts with that?
So, I mean, there's some interesting work that's been done out there. I know David Hamilton, I believe he's still with Tampa Bay, when he was with the British field hockey team. He used to do a series of tests, drop jump in particular, and he did it every day. And he would do it before games. He did it all the time, and he basically was able to monitor this over time. So for me, like a vertical jump, and let's use basketball as an example, at the end of their warm up, do a vertical jump and just track it. But you'll know where they are congested. Where do you expect it to be challenged? For example, we're doing work right now on my doctoral student, Maeve. She's looking at, the effect of travel on different markers. of performance. What happens to your vertical jump when you travel across the country. So, for example, I live in Western Australia, which is the most isolated major city in the entire world. So there's only one professional basketball team or one professional soccer team in Western Australia. The nearest ones are all over east. So let's put that as a frame. Australia is the same distance as the landmass from as America. So we're kind of the equivalent of LA. All our games are in New York, Georgia, and Florida. There are no games anywhere else. So our athletes over here, when they travel, what is the impact of this continual training, flying back and forth to the East Coast all the time? And so she's kind of diving deep into that. And obviously, we expect travel fatigue to impact performance, right? So if we could create a model and understand what's happening in those fatigue states, then we can understand what countermeasures to put in. And that I think is where this all gets interesting because different people respond differently to different exposures. Um, the more fit you are, the better your fitness base, the easier it is to do a congested schedule. The less fit you are, the harder it is. I would argue it all ties back to recoverability. So then it becomes a more holistic approach. What impacts recoverability? Well, one, the foundation of fitness that you've built previously. Two, the rocks. Are you getting enough sleep? Is sleep appropriate? If you don't have your sleep right, everything falls apart. Two, nutrition. I would argue nutrition is one of the most underutilized or underappreciated recovery interventions out there. If you eat correctly and you periodize your nutrition appropriately, you will basically enhance your ability to tolerate repetitive straining stress, right? Um, if you can get those in line, then you can then align those with your training. So, for example, if I have increased training load, what do we do in our diet? We increase carbohydrate intake. Why? To apply fuel for performance. If I have less training, day off, I can reduce carbohydrate because I don't need it in my diet for performance. But protein stays pretty consistent. This is some work out of the English Institute of Sport, which I find really fascinating. So we can use those strategies. We can use strategies like micro naps and things like that for sleep issues. We can monitor those things. Now, there's a whole question about monitoring. Like, I'm a big fan of tech. I think, things like Whoop, Aura, all those things can give us really valuable data. But there's also this kind of privacy kind of thing. So if I have all my athletes have a Whoop, then I know when they're in the club at 2 in the morning. If I am the sports scientist and I'm collecting the data, and that becomes a problem from these two balancing facts of people need to have autonomy and they need to have their personal rights, but I am trying to maximize their performance. So I've got to get them on board and on side to actually do these things. But nutrition and sleep foundation, and then you can use the training stimulus. Obviously, if you're getting enough sleep and you're eating well, you can train harder. Um, but as someone once said, you can't build you can't build a foundation on sand. If you haven't built the foundation correctly in the off season, it's going to be really difficult to keep that player together through the entire year. Um, and taking long stretches of time off from training is really quite detrimental when you're at the pinnacle of your sport.
For sure. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for all of these insights. Really appreciate it. Final two
Yeah.
questions to wrap it up, just to be mindful of time. Um, One, I know I made a comment about this earlier already. A lot of books behind you. Is there a
Yeah.
favorite book that you have? And two, if someone wants to find out more information about potentially being your doctoral student or just more about your university, what's the best way for them to reach out or find out
So
more
I'm going to
info?
ask you a question first. Favorite book I've written or a favorite book I've read?
Read. Actually, both. Let's get both.
All right. So the favorite book I've read is by Admiral McRaven. And so it's not a sports science book. Lessons of the Bullfrog. It's a leadership book about how to lead people. I'm fascinated by how you get people to do things. So I'm very much into that space. So McRaven's book on a bullfrog, Lessons from the Bullfrog or something like that. It is Bullfrogs in the title. One of my favorite books of all time. It's in the bookshelf in the back. I've read it numerous times. It's a tie between that and Make Your Bed, that he wrote, which is a book on why you should make your bed. I grew up in a military family. My dad was a Marine, so I kind of that mindset really connects with me. Now, the favorite book I've written, I'm actually really proud of my periodization text. That was a 5 year experience. Uh, that book was it's my life's work, and it's about all the things that I have learned about periodization from all the masters that I've had the opportunity to work with. I was trained by Professor Mike Stone. I've worked with Bill Kramer. I co-wrote a book with Tudor Bompa. I consider Kale Hakkinen is one of my mentors, and also a good friend of mine over the last maybe 6 years is Dietmar Schmidt-Bleicher. And so learning from all these legends and kind of putting together my thoughts on periodization, I'm really proud of it. I'm really excited for the next edition, which we're hoping is going to come in the next couple years, where I'm going to kind of dive into some newer topics and try to expand some of the things that we're working on. So for me, those are probably those books, but I would argue that books are really critical, and reading is an important one. Professor Brad Nindle sent me a gift a while ago called The Leader's Bookshelf. And it was a book written by an admiral about how reading and books are a big part of understanding the world we live in. And it's a library or a laboratory to learn. So I think reading is critical. Now, where can you find me? I have a Substack, my Substack mTOR Strength Sciences, where I've been putting out things periodically over the last 6 months. Um, I've become really interested in disseminating information to the wider world than just in academic articles recently. So that's where I put a lot of things, and I often touch on really controversial topics, places where I might not agree with some of the modern theories. Um, and then I'm on Instagram as well, and Doc Hoff, Doc underscore Hoff. And then I'm at Edith Cowan University at the moment, and we have, if you're Australian, it's a great opportunity to come uh, on a Commonwealth supported scholarship. They actually have discounts right now for Australian students only, sadly. So we're an online course where you could train from anywhere. We've had many people. We've had what's his name? Willie. Willie. He used to be with Oklahoma City Thunder, and then he's in Houston. Willie. Oh, I
Willie
can see him.
Cruz.
He's Willie Cruz. He's one of our students, one of our graduates. Willie was awesome. Really brought a flair to our course because he has different experiences, and it's great to have professionals. We've had NFL coaches. We've had people from New Zealand rugby. It's a really interesting course because it's about the science of strength and conditioning online with a 2 week intensive at ECU. So that's our coursework, but also we take research students from around the world. Scholarships are a little bit of a challenge at the moment, but really good students and great opportunities. And we do a lot of collaborations around the world too. We work with university. I'm also on University of Salford's staff as an adjunct. Work a lot with Cardiff Metropolitan on youth resistance training, which I think is really, really important. Um, so I'm pretty easy to get to. I do respond to emails, not as quick as I once did because I'm a little bit busier, but I do get back to people in a timely fashion because I think it's important to share. And then I'm always at the NSCA National Conference as the past president. And I feel I'm approachable. I often spend a lot of time talking to people about just strength and conditioning. And this year I'm making my return to TSAC in Orlando. I haven't been to TSAC in a very, very long time. And I've coupled together the resources to make the long journey to Orlando in August. And I'm really quite excited to be at the TSAC conference and catch up with my friends in that space.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate your time, your insights. We dropped all the links for the books, the
Yeah.
Substack, the colleges in the chat, and then when we upload this also, we will have it in the description below for people to follow along. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Haff, for your time. Appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you for having me.